Chapter 6. "What the fuck?" said the goblin. "Am I doing here?" It had taken Paul a long time and a great deal of concentration to learn to tell goblins apart. It should have been easy, because some of them were rat-headed, some of them had faces like pigs or dogs, some of them could almost have passed for human, but for the 6-inch curved tusks on the third nostril. This one was basically a dog with a hint of cat around the cheekbones, and it only took Paul about a second and a half to remember where he'd seen it before. He even remembered that he knew his name, except he'd forgotten it for the moment. You," he said, and then, "Where's she gone? What have you done with her?" But the goblin only stared, first at Paul, then at the bits of grain in its paw. "For crying out loud," it hissed in a loud stage whisper. "I can't be seen out like this. Do something." A duck waddled up, stopped dead 18 inches from the goblin's feet, opened its wing and flew away terribly fast. "What? I mean, what?" The goblin had started quivering like a giant guitar string. "I don't bloody know, do I? Quick, take your coat off and give it here. Quickly. Your lot may be as perceptive as a box of small rocks, but any moment now someone's going to start screaming, and then we'll all be up to our asses in the filth." Valid point. Paul slipped off his jacket and draped it awkwardly around the goblin's shoulders. I know who you are," he said. Colin the goblin. You overheard me talking about Van Speed's crystals and wanted to buy some off me." The goblin flinched as if it had misjudged climbing over a very powerful electric fence. "Fuck you," it said. "Who are you? Cops or something? That wasn't me. I wasn't even—" "We went to your lockup," Paul went on. "You offered me, what was it, 4 million? "How the hell do—" The goblin peered closely at Paul's face, then took a step back. "Look," he said, "I don't know who you are, what in buggery's going on, but the bloke I offered to buy the crystals off didn't look anything like you. Anyway, I know for a fact he's dead, so you can't be him, and I didn't buy them anyhow. You wouldn't sell. And failing to traffic in prohibited substances isn't a crime in anybody's book, not even if the judges were Dave Blunkett and Attila the Hun. So if you'll kindly stop frigging me about and send me back—" "Send you back?" Paul repeated. I didn't bring you here. Talking of which—" "What?" Colin the goblin opened his round little eyes until they were the size of blood-red tennis balls. "Well, I didn't get you by fucking taxi, sunshine. Last thing I knew, I was sitting in my office doing this month's VAT, and then suddenly—" "What do you mean, then suddenly?" A wave of panic broke over Paul like a surfer's dream. "If you didn't— Look, have you seen a girl, human, about 5'2", straight dark brown hair?" "Course not," snarled Colin. "I follow the rules, mate. Not going topside until the doors are locked. Keep out the way of humans at all times. At least," he added ferociously, "I try to follow the rules, except of course when I'm suddenly whisked away by titanic supernatural forces and dumped in a wide open space full of humans and birds." Paul began to argue, and maybe he shifted his feet and accidentally trod on a questing duck, because one of them suddenly exploded off the ground in a flurry of wings, zooming straight up past his nose. Instinctively he jumped back and shut his eyes, and when he opened them again, there was Sophie, just as she had been, with a stunned expression on her face and grains of birdseed dribbling out of her fingers. "Sophie," Paul said quietly, "did I just go somewhere?" She turned her head and looked at him, her face completely empty. "Only I could have sworn—" "Let me guess," Paul interrupted quickly. "You were sitting at a desk and there were these forms." "VAT returns," Sophie said, nodding. "I know about them. I've got an accountant who's an uncle. I meant the other way round, and in the holidays I used to—" She shook herself like a wet dog. "Screw that," she said. "I don't want to talk about that. How the hell do you know about the desk and the—" "Because," Paul said, trying to keep still and calm, "you vanished, and where you're standing now there was this goblin, and he told me—" "Goblin? Oh God, I think I'm going to throw up. I turned into a goblin." Paul shook his head. I don't think so," he said. "I think you just changed places for a second or two. Look, why don't we go somewhere instead of discussing this in the middle of St. James's bloody park?" "But the ducks—" "Oh, for—" Paul held out the hand with the birdseed bag in it and turned it over. Birdseed swamped his left foot, and immediately he could feel duck beaks drumming on his toe, like a horse of elven chiropodists. "There," he said. "All done. Now, shall we go somewhere a little bit less bloody public?" "All right." Sophie staggered slightly as she followed him across the park, over the road, suddenly no traffic, and into a pasta bar, which happened to be the nearest public building. Paul practically had to shove her into a seat. "Well," she said, smiling suddenly and without apparent provocation, "while we're here we might as well have lunch." "What?" It took Paul a moment to remember the meaning of the word lunch. It was rather like hearing English unexpectedly when you've been living with a remote tribe in the heart of the rainforest for the last 5 years. Oh, right, lunch," he said. "Why not?" "Great," Sophie replied. "I'm starving." And she grabbed the tall, plastic-coated menu. "Right, I think I'll go for the straight spag bowl, but with—" "Sophie?" He caught himself a touch too late. He'd said it the way Paul Carpenter used to say it, back when they were living together, and she'd said or done something so outstandingly unreasonable that even he felt compelled to protest. "Miss Pettingill," he corrected, but that didn't sound right either. "Look," he compromised. "Before we start getting all wrapped up in spaghetti," he said, and his scowl was so fierce that the giggle evaporated on her lips, "I want to get to the bottom of this vanishing business." "You said you wanted lunch." "Oh, no, I didn't." "You said, let's nip across the road and find somewhere. All right, you didn't actually say lunch, but it sounded like—" Bloody hell. Apparently, Phil Marlowe had a shorter temper than Paul Carpenter. "All right, let me clarify the position. This is a serious inquiry into something really bizarre and scary. It's not a date, all right?" Sophie looked at him, and it was like peering into a long, dark tunnel. "Whatever," she said. "But I'm still starving. I can't handle a whole portion of garlic bread, so let's go halves." Garlic bread," Paul repeated. "All right, yes, why the hell not? And then we can talk about you disappearing and turning into a goblin called Colin?" She opened both her eyes very wide. "Colin?" "I don't know. I think it's a goblin thing. They know we can't pronounce their real names, something like that. Doesn't matter. The point is I recognised him. I met him before." Sophie frowned, as if groping for a point. "Small world?" she suggested hopefully. "And Paul ground on. Why was it he felt like he was reading out a scientific paper to an audience of small children and clowns? He seemed just as surprised as you did, so my guess is it wasn't him who made it happen." "I don't know," he admitted. "I was so scared you'd been, well, vanished, like the other time." He stopped short. Did he even know about the other time? "It was you, wasn't it?" he rallied bravely. "Who got kidnapped by the elf woman? What's her name?" "Countess Judy," Sophie replied with a faint shudder. "And she wasn't an elf. They're pointed ears and lace wings and ballet costumes. Countess Judy was the queen of the Fae, which is a totally different kettle of barracudas," she added with feeling. That's right, I remember now. Anyhow, that was what I thought, and a waiter was standing over them. Sophie asked for something technical, bits of Italian, including one word which Paul had always thought meant typewriter. He grunted. "Same for me," and the waiter went away. "That's really sweet," Sophie was saying. "That you were worried, I mean." Sweet? Sweet? It suddenly occurred to him that maybe the real Sophie was still missing, and that goblins can be anyone they choose, because Sophie didn't use the S word, not ever. But goblins always gave themselves away, if you knew what to look for. There was a grin, a certain gleam in the eye, and he wasn't looking at it, even so. Sweet, for crying out loud. "Well," he said awkwardly, "if there's even the remotest chance that Countess Judy's come back—" "Oh," her face closed down again. "That's what you were worried about. I see. Well, I don't think it was anything like that. I mean, I can remember exactly what it was like when the Fae got me, and you wouldn't mistake it for anything else. Trust me." The waiter came back, dumped 2 plates of spaghetti down in front of them and went away. Sophie grabbed her fork and started to twirl. That was perhaps the most reassuring piece of evidence so far. Paul had watched Sophie eat spaghetti many times, always with fascinated horror. The ruthless way she twirled the stuff onto her fork put him in mind of the propeller of a vast tanker getting tangled in fishermen's nets, and the culmination of the procedure, when she poked the entanglement into her face and went slurped, was like that bit with the giant squid in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. "Let's not talk about it any more, okay?" she said, as the teens spun relentlessly in the tangled mess. "Right, so it was like really weird, but a lot of weird things happen around JWW, and I'm still alive and in one piece, so it can't have been that big a deal." She reached out a hand and grabbed the peppermill. Another important clue, because Sophie couldn't eat a plate of mince in tomato effluent without first poisoning it beyond redemption with a thick lava crust of ground black pepper. "Good idea," Paul said. "In that case, maybe you could answer a question for me. It's not something I felt able to ask anyone else in the office, but... Sophie looked at him over her fork. Far away? This bloke who was here before me, he said, and paused, making a play of trying to remember a once-heard name. Carpenter? She nodded vigorously. Paul Carpenter. He joined the same time as I did. Ah, right. So, what exactly happened to him? Oh, he died. Paul froze. He could feel the ends of his fingers and the tips of his ears getting cold, because she hadn't said, he died, in a low, strangled, choking back sobs way. It was that initial, oh, that screwed everything up. Apparently, he was at this really wild party with a load of goblins, and everybody was pretty well pissed as rats, and there was an accident. Paul didn't say anything for a moment. He was waiting for some appropriate comment about what a tragedy it was, a promising young life cut short. We shall not see his like again. But Sophie just carried on twirling her fork, pitching the mess into her face, and sucking in the ends like a supercharged Dyson. That was it then. He died, but it was his own silly fault. Even so. That must have been quite a shock, he said, if you've been working with the bloke. Well, slurp, another dozen thread ends vanished between Sophie's thin lips. Yes, it was completely unexpected, of course. You're always a bit stunned when someone you know gets killed or something like that, but it's not like we were close or anything. You lying bitch. You pasta-sucking heartless cow. Ah, right, Paul said. So, did he have any family? She shook her head. Parents emigrated, I think, and I never heard he had any other close relatives. Sad, really, being all on your own like that. He was all right, I suppose. A bit dozy most of the time, rather immature, but harmless enough. And of course, I got stuck with all his work as well as my own. We were both helping Professor Van Spee. Have you run into him at all? Very polite, but a bit creepy. And God only knows what this project he's working on is actually about. And of course, he never explains anything. It's really annoying. Hardly a seamless change of subject. As far as Sophie was concerned, Paul Carpenter could be dismissed in a few rather disapproving sentences, because that was all he merited. Thanks, Paul said, winching the Marlowe smile across his face. Only, people around the office keep mentioning him, but whenever I've asked, they just go all quiet and then start talking about something else. I was wondering if it was some deadly secret or something. Sophie shook her head, and the upturned ends of her straight, dark brown hair trailed lightly on her bolognese sauce, like a lover's fingertips traced delicately across your cheek. You would expect there to be some desperate goings-on behind it all, what with all the weird shit that happens at JWW, but apparently it really was just a stupid accident. It was something really silly, like a giant cake collapsing and smothering him. It's not actually all that funny, of course, but if you'd ever met Paul, you'd realise how, well, appropriate, really. She smiled faintly, then went on. I think it was Rosie's party. That's Mr. Tanner's mother. She works on reception. I have an idea that Paul had a crush on her, which sounds a bit yuck, her being a goblin. But of course, she can change her shape at will, and she's got this thing about turning herself into these really obvious tarty women. I'm afraid the poor old Paul was a complete sucker for all that stuff. Possible explanation. She knows who I really am, and she's punishing me deliberately for pretending to be someone else, not telling her I'm actually still alive. Possible, but rather unlikely. He sounds like a real loser, Paul snarled. No wonder you were glad to see the back of him. Oh, he wasn't as bad as all that, Sophie said, and she was smiling, with that faint glow he'd seen a few times in a girl's eyes, though never when they were pointed at him. Usually that glow was his cue to make an excuse and leave before things got nauseatingly embarrassing. How often he'd dreamed about the day when he'd be on the receiving end of a glow like that. And now here it was, and all he really wanted to do was pick up his plate of spaghetti and tomato sauce and grind it into her face. Not as bad as all that. She'd loved him once, he knew it. Even he couldn't have imagined it all. But she'd never glowed at him like that. It had been a fierce, reluctant love, almost as though she'd resented the completeness of her devotion to him. Indeed, now he thought about it, it struck him that she never enjoyed being in love with him. All the time it had been an intrusion, a weakness, almost a feeling. Now, though, he could see a deep pleasure behind that glow, and if someone, Mr. Leartides maybe, were to sidle up to her and offer her an antidote guaranteed to cure her, purge every trace of it out of her system, she'd be all horrified and refuse. Bitch, he thought. A cute nose, a pretty face, and they aren't even real. And suddenly she's floating on air, singing in the rain, all happy. How shallow can you get? It was worse than if she'd taken a love philter, because... Paul broke off from his train of thought and opened his eyes wide. Oblivious in her joy, Sophie had wound 2 turns of her hair onto her fork, along with the spaghetti, and was just about to stuff it into her mouth. He said, but it was too late. She closed her mouth, removed the fork, did the big slurp, and realised, at a rather fundamental level, things weren't quite as they should be. She spluttered, yeah. Insensitive and immature he might have been, but Paul reckoned he knew Sophie quite well enough to predict what her reaction would be if he burst out laughing at this juncture. On the other hand, what with one thing and another, it had been some time since he'd had a good laugh, and if anything in the whole world was genuinely delightfully funny, it was the expression on her face. Screw it, Paul thought, and then the laughter took over. He was still laughing when Sophie jumped up, knocking over her chair, and fled, through the door and out into the street, with the end of her hair still in her mouth, entwined with spaghetti like ivy and Russian vine. Then he tried to pull himself together, but only because people were staring. More joy in heaven, he thought, as he dragged money out of his wallet and dropped it on the table. He didn't dare try and finish his meal for fear of choking to death. He found his way out into the street, leaned against a wall, and laughed until he felt his stomach muscles twanging like guitar strings. "So you fed them," said Mr. Leartides, leaning back in his chair with his hands clasped behind his head. "Then what?" Paul hesitated. By rights, of course, he ought to tell his boss the whole story. For all he knew, the business with Sophie vanishing and being replaced by Colin the Goblin was the entire point of the experiment. The fact was, however, that there were elements of the story he didn't feel like explaining. How he'd first come across Colin, for example. Also, in spite of, or precisely because of how helpful and nice Mr. Leartides had been to him, he still didn't trust him as far as he could sneeze him through a blocked nostril. "Nothing much," he therefore replied. "It was lunchtime, so we had lunch." "Where?" "Some pasta place just across the road. I can't remember what it was called. Sorry." "Pasta," Mr. Leartides replied. "Never got on with the stuff myself, I have to admit. Irrational, I know, but I never could drum up any enthusiasm for eating string. Give me a nice bacon sandwich any day. So then what?" "Then we came back here," Paul said. "That's all?" "Yes." "Oh," Mr. Leartides shrugged. "Well, we can't expect miracles. All right, here's what I want you to do this afternoon." He leaned forward, grabbed a copy of the Evening Standard off his desk, and opened it. "Odeon, Tottenham Court Road. Programme starts at 2:30, but that means there's 20 minutes of trailers and mobile phone adverts, so really it means 10 to 3, which ought to give you plenty of time. Julia Roberts and Russell Crowe. Do a pink form when you get back for the tickets and popcorn." Tickets. Plural, Paul noticed. "Hang on," he said. "You want me to go to the pictures?" Mr. Leartides nodded. "It's extremely important," he replied, "especially in light of this morning. Yes, I think it's got to be done. You'll need to take someone with you, of course." Paul stared at him. "Will I?" "Well, of course, otherwise there wouldn't be any point. The whole thing would be a waste of time. Tell you what," he went on, "you might as well get that Pettingale female to go with you. Theo can manage on his own for one afternoon." Paul breathed out slowly through his nose before answering. "Actually," he said, "that might not be a good idea. I think I might have offended her when we were doing the ducks thing." "Really? What did you do? Make a pass at her?" He wasn't sure why that made him so angry. Possibly the casual way Mr. Leartides said it, as though Paul was the sort of person who went round making passes at girls, rather than just wanting to, but never having the courage. "No, of course I bloody didn't," he said. Mr. Leartides shrugged. "All right," he said. "Keep your hair on. So what did you do?" "I laughed." "Laughed?" Paul nodded. "She got a bit of her hair wound round her fork along with the spaghetti. She didn't think it was very funny." "Silly cow," Mr. Leartides grinned. "Really? She did that? What happened?" "Anyway," Paul said firmly, "I don't think she'd want to go to the pictures with me after that. Not even if it's work." "She'll bloody well go if I tell her to," Mr. Leartides said. "First rule of business, don't let your personal feelings and antipathies get in the way of the job." "Yes, right," Paul said appeasingly. "That's so true, yes. But if it's all the same to you, I mean, if she's sitting there feeling all sullen and resentful, then she won't be concentrating properly on, well, whatever it is we're supposed to be there for, will she?" "I suppose not," Mr. Leartides replied. "All right, find someone else." Right," Paul said. Then, "Who, though?" He paused. "I suppose I could ask Mr. Shumway." "No," Mr. Leartides said quickly. "No, that'd be no good. He has to go and do the banking at 4. Look, it doesn't necessarily have to be someone from the office even. Don't you know any girls who'd—" He hesitated. "No, of course not." I keep forgetting you're dead, so you don't know anybody much. Paul frowned. I suppose it's always Mr. Tanner's mother, he said. No, absolutely not. I mean, she's needed on reception. Look, are you quite sure about the Pettingale girl? I'm sure if you apologise nicely... No, really, I'll think of someone, I'm sure, Paul added hopefully. 2:30, did you say? In that case, I'd better be going. Mr. Lairtides nodded. No need to come back here when the film's finished, he said. See you in the morning. All right. Paul was halfway to the street when the obvious answer struck him. He turned left and walked down the corridor to his office. He hadn't been in there since he'd died and resurrected himself as Phil Marlowe, so he wasn't prepared for what he found, which was nothing at all. The room had been stripped bare of contents. They'd even taken up the carpet and removed the light bulb. The only thing left was the phone, resting on the floor with its flex curled up around it like a cat's tail. He knelt down and dialed Vicky's extension. Hello, he said. I need someone to help with something. Are you free? Well, I'm hardly rushed off my feet, Vicky's voice replied. You haven't actually given me any work to do since you've arrived, so what have I got to do? A surge of embarrassment, powerful enough to swamp a tropical atoll, swept through Paul, and he replied, It's a bit complicated. Come down to my office, I'll tell you when you get here. Slight pause. Your office? You mean Mr. Lair? No, my office. Paul Carpenter's old room. I suppose it's my office, no one else seems to want it for anything. Less than a minute later, Vicky knocked on the door and came in. Today she had her hair pinned and combed on one side, swept over her shoulder on the other. She smiled at him and said, Well? First, Paul took a step away from her, felt the wall against his back. First, I've got to tell you, this isn't my idea. In fact, it's a direct order from Mr. Lairtides. It's vitally important for the job he's doing. Honest, he added. You can ask him if you don't... Hold it, she interrupted. What's the thing you want me to do? You said you'd explain. Yes, right, Paul stopped, tried to appear calm, cool, at peace with the world. Look, Mr. Lairtides says I've got to go to Tottenham Court Road. Right, got you. I just got to nick back upstairs and fetch my coat. And watch a film, Paul went on. Julie Roberts and Russell Crowe and... no way to cushion the shock, better just blurt it out and have done. And I've got to take someone with me, and the person I first thought of wouldn't want to go, so I thought I'd ask you. Of course, if you're busy... Not likely, she grinned. Stay there. I'll be right back. The medicine, Paul muttered to himself as the door closed behind him. Thank God for the medicine or we'd be in real trouble here. It wasn't just that Vicky had somehow managed to grow even lovelier since he'd seen her last. He was used to that sort of thing, thanks to Mr. Tanner's mum, and he was practically immune. It was the sheer enthusiasm she displayed at the thought of going out with him. Hold it there, he commanded himself. Just because we're going somewhere and it's at the office, that doesn't make it going out. And it'd never been like that with Sophie, that unalloyed cheerfulness. With Sophie, it had always been a case of the two of them facing up to the unavoidable fact that they loved each other, along the lines of, we're both in this mess, so we better pull together, bit between the teeth, shoulders to the wheel, and make the best of it, and all that jazz. Happiness hadn't really been a factor, apart from a very solemn sort of happiness that an uninformed outsider could well have mistaken for stoical resignation, but Vicky had practically bounced out of the room like Zebedee in the Magic Roundabout. Of course, a career victim might be led astray by that into thinking that she actually liked him, which would in turn inevitably lead to infatuation, rejection, heartbreak. Would it though? What if she did actually like him? The thought hit Paul like a kick from a mule. Now that he'd ditched Paul Carpenter and replaced him with handsome, confident, relaxed Phil Marlowe, it was no longer utterly unthinkable that a girl might just possibly like him a bit, or even a bit plus, in which case there might be something rather more desirable than rejection and heartbreak waiting for him at the bottom of life's cereal packet. Except, of course, that Paul Carpenter had taken the medicine, which meant Phil Marlowe was incapable of falling in love. Sod it, Paul thought, and looked around for something expendable to hit, but of course the room was empty. I'm ready. Vicky was standing in the doorway smiling at him, and for a moment he thought that maybe the medicine was starting to wear off. But he looked at her again and realised that what he thought might be the first flash of love's refining fire was probably only very mild indigestion. As he muttered, "We'd better be going then," and shooed her out of the room, a little voice in the back of his mind asked him if his reaction would have been different if it had been Sophie standing in the doorway smiling. Luckily, he knew where listening to voices in one's head could lead to, and ignored it. Wasn't a bad film, but Paul hadn't enjoyed it much. The producers had done their best, filling the screen with hurtling cars, chattering machine guns and great big explosions with cauliflowers of orange and red fire. It was, after all, a romantic comedy, but they failed to engage his interest. He was far more concerned with the presence in the seat next to him. Even when the gunfire and detonations were at their loudest, he was sure that he could hear the sound of her breathing, maybe even the slow beat of her heart. His general well-being wasn't helped by agonising cramp caused by sitting absolutely still to avoid any possibility of accidental bodily contact. It was a long film, but not nearly long enough. As far as Paul was concerned, it raced along like the last day of the holidays, every passing second bringing close the awful moment when the lights came up, and one or other of them would inevitably suggest rounding things off by going for a pizza. Even as poor Mr. Crow was locked in hand-to-hand combat with the villain 20,000 feet in the air on the wing of a speeding 747, Paul had his eyes shut to help him concentrate as he struggled to come up with an excuse that wouldn't sound too excruciatingly fatuous. Appointment with doctor, did or dentist, optician, physiotherapist, birthday party for parents, sibling, friend. Got to go back to the office and work was a non-starter. Vicky knew he didn't have anything to do because she was nominally his personal assistant. He was considering the merits of folding up like a dead spider and dropping to the ground, clutching his stomach and groaning. All right, so they might rush him into hospital and whip out his appendix, but that had to be preferable. When the lights came up and the screen was suddenly full of the names of assistant cameramen and location unit accountants, he shot up out of his seat like toast from a toaster and said, "Sorry, but I've got to get back home. They're delivering a new fridge freezer," before he realised she hadn't said a word. "Oh," Vicky said. "Right, well, see you at the office tomorrow then." A few minutes later, Paul was standing in the Tottenham Court Road, alone apart from 250,000 or so irrelevant and harmless strangers, embarking on the evening homeward lemming run. Against all odds, he'd made it. Carpenter 1, Cupid 0, and that, he felt, called for a celebratory drink. He chose a pub doorway at random, oozed his way through the crush to the bar, and eventually managed to get his hands on a full pint. Moderation was for wimps, of ginger beer shandy, which he carried off to an empty, smoke-shrouded corner. It was only once he had finished his drink that he realised just how thirsty he was. But it had been dry work, sitting absolutely still in a confined space, trying not to breathe too loudly. Paul fought his way back to the bar for a repeat prescription. The second pint made him feel much more lively. That suggested it must be doing him some good, in which case it was practically his duty to have a couple more, so he did. At which point boozer's relativity caught up with him, and he realised that what he needed most in the world was fresh air and a wall that kept still while he was leaning on it. There must have been something wrong with the fresh air, because as soon as Paul left the pub, something else seemed to have gone wrong with his legs. Furthermore, the wall he chose for support turned out to be one of those pesky slithering about types. As a result, though through no fault of his own, he staggered, tripped, and cannoned into a small, bold, round-headed man who happened to be passing by. "Steady on," the man said in an American accent. Fortunately, he didn't seem to mind being trodden on, because he grinned pleasantly. Maybe he had had trouble with slithery walls himself. "Sorry," Paul said, and then it occurred to him that the man's face was familiar. Hold on," he said. I know you from somewhere. Do you?" "Sure I do. I'd seen you somewhere just recently." He frowned. "That's it. You're what's it with the funny name? Shop, toothbrushes, and antique furniture." The man frowned. "We met in shop selling toothbrushes?" No. Paul shook his head, which must have provoked the wall somehow, because it shifted most inconveniently. Also the pavement started playing up, probably in sympathy with the wall. "Your shop. You've got a shop selling toothbrushes and old pictures and stuff." "I don't think so," the man said, "and I'm sure I'd be aware of it if I did." Carefully, Paul detached himself from the wall, took a cautious step forward, and examined the man closely. "No disrespect," he said, "but you're wrong there. It's you, definitely." The man raised his eyebrows. "Well, I can agree with you on that score, because I am definitely me. It's a shop that I'm having trouble with. Still, there you are. It's the thing I like about this country. There's scope for a wide range of different opinions." It occurred to Paul that it wasn't the end of the world, even if the man wasn't prepared to admit to being the shopkeeper. Maybe he was self-conscious about it or something. "It doesn't matter," he said, magnanimously. "Not to worry. Sorry about your foot." The man shrugged. "It's okay," he said. "I've got two." "That's all right then. Cheers." The man smiled and walked away, and Paul shifted along a bit, in search of stabler walls and less stroppy pavements. It was odd, he thought. Not that it figured tremendously in the vast overarching scheme of things, but the man he bumped into was quite definitely the man from the toothbrush shop. Mr. Paleologus! For some reason he couldn't quite pronounce it, even speaking wordlessly to his inner ear, but he could sort of see the word in his head. Funny sort of name, but that was Americans for you. Paul had been an earnest student of international affairs all his life, and nothing the Yanks got up to surprised him any more. The pavements were against him all the way back to the bus stop. A bit uncalled for, he felt, since all he'd done was brush up against the wall who happened to be a friend of theirs. He fell asleep on the bus and woke up just in time to scramble out at his stop. While he'd been dozing, the pavements had apparently found it in their stony hearts to forgive him, because they stayed more or less level as far as his front door. On the other hand, he'd got a bit of a headache, doubtless because he'd had his head at a funny angle or something in the seat. He trudged up the stairs and let himself in, but the lights weren't working. Fuse blown, he diagnosed instantly. Bugger. But that was all right. Paul knew where the fuse box was, and all you had to do was look at a row of switches till you found the one that had flipped itself down. There was just enough light seeping in from the street lamps to see by, and he hopped up on a kitchen chair to investigate. Remarkably, he found that all the fuses must have blown simultaneously, because all the switches were pointing the same way. Freak power surge, he decided. Probably a powerful electric storm. He flipped them all over, climbed down and tried the lights, which still didn't work. Funny. "It's silly," said a voice. "It's the bulb that's gone, not the fuse, and now you've turned them all off, so nothing works." All right," Paul replied, feeling a trifle foolish. "I'll just put them back then." He clambered back onto the chair, did all the switches, and then thought, "Just a second. Voice. Hello?" he said cautiously. "Who's that?" "Me," the voice replied. "Over here." "I can't see you." "That's because the bulb's gone, you pinhead." "Yes, but maybe it was the befuddling effects of his nap on the bus, or the dizziness from hopping on and off chairs, or just possibly it was a side effect of the ginger beer shandies, but Paul couldn't quite marshal words he needed to get across what he wanted to say, namely, who the hell are you and what are you doing in my flat? Screw verbal communication anyway, he decided. Why ask when he could see for himself, which he could do perfectly easily, just as soon as he'd changed that annoying bulb, which he couldn't do in the dark, because he couldn't find a spare. And this was where he had an ace in the hole in this battle against the universe. He did know exactly where to lay his hand on a candle and a box of matches, right here on the kitchen shelf next to the pasta jar. Paul located the jar rather cleverly by touch, and the crash it made as it hit the tiles confirmed its identity. And there next to it, just as he thought, were the candle and the matchbox. He struck a match, tried to light his middle finger, decided that was a bad idea, and lit the wick of the candle instead. Now he had light, armed with which he was the equal of anything the world could throw at him. He picked up the candle and directed its glowing yellow circle around the room. Nobody there. "Stop mucking about," he ordered, because an Englishman's home is his castle, even though most Englishmen tend to end up in the dungeons. "Where are you?" "Here," the voice said, sounding bored. "Where I usually am." That didn't make a whole lot of sense, because if Paul had been sharing his flat with whoever the voice belonged to, he reckoned he'd have noticed it by now. "Fine," he said. "Humour me. Where's that?" "Right in front of you, of course, between the sink and the washing machine." Paul frowned and lifted the candle higher. There was the sink, right? Yes. There was the washing machine. Between them, there was just the fridge. No gap large enough for anybody to hide in. "But no, you aren't," Paul pointed out. "Yes, I am." "No, you bloody well aren't. Look," he added, marching across the floor and standing next to the fridge door. "No gap, see? Sink, fridge, washing machine. Nobody there." The voice sighed. "You've been drinking," it said. "That'd account for it, even if you aren't generally this stupid." Paul froze. He had a nasty feeling that the voice was coming from inside the fridge. Nerving himself against what he might find, he grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. Nothing. The light didn't even come on, and his candle flame showed him nothing except a sad-looking lump of antique cheese and a milk carton. This was really stupid, but... "Are you in there?" This time the voice laughed. "In the manner of speaking," it said, at which point Paul realised that for the last few minutes he'd been having a conversation with his fridge. He slammed the door shut and jumped back. "You?" Finally, a long sigh and a faint gurgle of plumbing. "For someone in your line of work, you're a bit bloody slow off the mark." You're the fridge?" Yes, I am the fridge, of course. I knew that already. But pity about the 4 pints of intoxicant. This was a situation he'd have preferred to face without having to think his way through all that beer. You can't be. I've been keeping food in you for the last 9 months. I mean, how long? I've always been here, the fridge replied, and repeated the gurgling noise, which put Paul in mind of something or other he couldn't quite place. Looking after you, like I promised I would. But now I need you to do something for me. Oh, what? Switch me back on. He's been here. He turned me off at the mains. If I got caught, I'll die. It's all right. I've still got half an hour left, at least. But if you wouldn't mind... Like you promised, Paul said. Promised who? The switch, please. Oh, sorry, yes. Hot wax from the candle had run down over the back of his hand. He nearly dropped it. I'll just turn on the lamp here so I can see. Don't bother. It won't work. I told you he was here. He's killed all the pups. Down on his hands and knees, Paul followed the line of the skirting board to find the electric point. There, he said as he flicked the switch. Is that better? The fridge gave a great sigh. Yes, it said. That's fine. Right, Paul stood up, bumping his head against the worktop. Now, who did you promise you'd look after me to? The fridge gurgled again. Actually, I made 2 promises. The other one was not to tell you. The headache was much worse now. Look, Paul said. That's silly. Just a moment, he added as something else the fridge had said battled his way through the shandy entanglement into his mind. Did you say someone's been here? Yes, he tried to kill me, and he killed all the light pups. And I suppose you aren't allowed to tell me? Of course I am stupid. I told you. It's my duty to protect you. It was Utgath Lucky. Paul paused for a moment. Sorry, he said. What did you just say? It was Utgath Lucky, the fridge repeated. He came in here. Who the hell is Utgath Loki? Stunned silence. Then the fridge said, What do you mean? Orange juice from now on. I mean, Paul said slowly, who's Utgath Loki? He is... Pause. Don't you understand? No. Oh. Silence. Paul could almost hear the sound of the fridge concentrating. Utgath Loki is him. That's who he is. That's the name. Look, what's so difficult about that? You aren't making any sense, Paul shouted. Listen, I've never heard of anybody called whatever it is you just said. It doesn't mean anything to me. You've never heard of... The fridge started to whir ominously. Of course you have. You must have. That's like saying you've never heard of Yot or Donor. Who? There was a bang and the fridge door flew open, narrowly missing Paul's knee. Now look what you've made me do, the fridge said bitterly. Bloody hell, don't you know anything? Apparently not, Paul replied. Can't you just start at the beginning? And was it one of those people you just said who made you promise, just shut my door, will you? And while you're at it, get that disgusting piece of cheese out of me. There's stuff growing all over it. Thank you. Right. Yes. The fridge appeared to have calmed down a little. That's better. It was horrible, like having toothache. Please, Paul said, can you explain what this is all about? Like, from the beginning. And who are all those people with the funny names? Oh, God. The fridge sounded despondent. I'd have thought he'd have taught you something, but apparently not. All right. It's like this. In the beginning, there was nothing but mist and fire and empty space. Then the fountain Hervgemea surged up out of the darkness, and from it sprang 12 rivers. Excuse me, Paul interrupted. But what are you talking about? You said begin at the beginning, so I am. As the waters of the 12 rivers cooled down and began to freeze. Not that beginning, Paul protested. Look, all I want to know is, who's this Utgath person you keep talking about? Began to freeze, the fridge repeated icily. And when they congealed, they took the shape of the first living creature, the giant Mir. Meanwhile, Odumla, the great cow of heaven. All right, Paul whined. All right, forget it. Sorry I asked. But it's important, the fridge said angrily. No, it's not. How dare you? The fridge roared so loud that Paul nearly jumped out of his skin. What kind of attitude is that, for pity's sake? Here I've been all this time doing everything I possibly could to keep you safe, and you can't even be bothered to listen. It's not right. You've passed 2 of the 3 great tests, more by luck than judgment. Needless to say, but even so, technically you've passed. And now we've got to get you ready for the 3rd one, which is why you ought to know these things. Why? Paul yelled. Why is it important? What the hell does it matter to me? Any of it. I'm just this small, inoffensive bloke who wants to have a quiet life and be left alone. And what do I get? Talking fridges and the great cow of heaven. It's not bloody fair, really. Long pause, then. Have you quite finished? Yes. Better now. Paul nodded. Right then. Just as well, because I don't think we've got much time. Where were we? The great cow. Oh, yes. From the udders of Ordumla, the great cow of heaven, dripped the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, water. From these elements, the giant created all things. The sky, the sea, the land, or at least that's how it was in the beginning, originally. But then, quite some time later, obviously but also next, then Utgath Loki stole the great cow from her stall, and in secret, unsuspected by the other gods. What other gods? Paul interrupted. You said there was just this giant and the cow, and you never said where the cow came from either. She was formed out of the droplets of sea spray breaking on the cliffs of Surtime, obviously. But the gods came in much later. This is all before that, or at least it was. That's the whole problem. Anyhow, you're making me get ahead of myself. Utgath Loki stole the great cow, and unsuspected by the other gods, he drew from her udders a 5th element, purely for his own use. Stronger, more versatile, infinitely more dangerous, easy to make at home from sustainable resources. This element, which is all around us every day, pervading every corner of our lives and posing a horrific threat to the fabric of the universe, is in fact click. The fridge didn't actually say the click part. That was a sound effect coming from somewhere up above Paul's head and to the right. Paul waited for a moment, just in case the fridge was doing it on purpose to heighten the suspense. Then he tore open the fridge door. No light. Bloody fuses, Paul snarled aloud. He groped for his candle and knocked it over. It went out. He tried feeling for the matchbox, then remembered that he'd left it over on the countertop. He got up, found the chair, stood on it, reset the fuse. No problems whatsoever with any of that. It was as he tried to get off the chair that he trod in something slippery, wobbled for a moment, lost his balance, skidded the length of the kitchen floor, and slammed very hard indeed into the door frame. Then he went to sleep. When Paul woke up, he had a bad headache. He also had a crick in his neck that made him whimper when he tried to get up. Also, he noticed he wasn't in bed. For some reason, he'd chosen to go to sleep in the kitchen doorway, like someone's faithful dog. With the benefit of hindsight, and the light streaming in through the windows was so obnoxiously bright that even the hindsight hurt, he could see this hadn't been a good idea, and he wondered why he'd done it. Also, why he was still fully dressed in his work suit. Then memory began to seep back, like oil through a chip wrapper. The pub. Alcohol abuse. That, of course, explained everything. The headache, the lack of judgment as regards sleeping arrangements, even the hazy recollection at the back of his mind of a long and earnest conversation with his fridge. Something about a cow. Talking of fridges, Paul stood up, wobbled, and sat down again. Since he'd more or less mastered the walking business by the time he was 2, he wondered what was wrong. But a quick survey of the floor, followed by a cursory examination of the soles of his shoes, revealed rather a lot of gunchy, slippery yellow stuff. Something he'd trodden in at some point in his adventures, and it was probably just as well he couldn't remember anything about it. He crawled to his knees and stomped across the floor to the fridge, opened the door and gazed blearily inside. Once he'd got used to the blinding glare of the light, he found what he'd needed. A beautifully chilled Coke can, which he pressed carefully against his throbbing temples. Blessed numbness gradually spread, and he sighed. 30 seconds of the treatment, and he felt ready for stage 2, a long drink of cold orange juice. The fridge was unusually well stocked, as well as 2 cartons of orange juice. There were eggs, bacon, sausages, he shuddered, cold drinks, milk, a Tesco moussaka, even some salady leaf things. Paul couldn't remember buying them, but there was so much that he couldn't remember about the previous evening that one small detail was neither here nor there. He stuck his thumb gracelessly through the cardboard of one of the juice cartons and swilled down half the contents. Better. Still not good, but better. Phases 3 and 4 involved aspirin and coffee. Phase 5 was a scheduled R&R break, 5 minutes sitting motionless at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. He hadn't worked out Phase 6 in any detail, since he'd hardly expected to live that long, but in the event he winged it, a shower, a shave, clean shirt and underwear, left him looking more or less human, and with luck nobody would get close enough to know any different. By 8:15 he was sentient, self-propelled and late for his bus. Dragging into the office at 9:20, Paul expected, at the very least, scornful looks and a mild rebuke. But most unusually, there was nobody on reception. The front office was deserted. The corridors were empty. Nobody to be seen. Anywhere. Arguably it was a definite improvement, but not the sort of thing to spring on someone with a delicate head first thing in the morning. For some reason he felt the need to walk very quietly as he made his way up the stairs, as though the building was asleep and wouldn't be pleased at being woken up. He stopped outside the door of Mr. Lairtide's office, knocked as usual, and waited. No reply. But inside he was sure he could hear curious shuffling noises. Then a voice he didn't know squeaked, "Come." There was someone sitting in Mr. Lairtide's chair, but it wasn't Mr. Lairtide's. Quite the opposite. In fact, Mr. Lairtide's was long and linear, where this bloke was short and built up of curves and radii. His head was almost perfectly circular, its profile unmarred by even the faintest trace of hair, and was poised snugly above a nest of chins, like a cat sitting on a pile of cushions. Paul was sure he knew him from somewhere. "Hello," said the stranger. Paul stared at him for a whole 4 seconds. Hello," he replied. Who are you, and where's Mr. Lairtide's?" The round man smiled agreeably. "Frank can't make it in today," he said. "He's asked me to hold the fort for him till he gets back. My name's Constantine, Porphyrogenitus, by the way, and you must be Paul Carpenter. Pleased to meet you." He stuck out a paw fringed with chipolata fingers, and when Paul hesitated to have anything to do with it, he laughed again. "It's all right," he said. "Frank briefed me about the Paul Carpenter Phil Marlowe business. Why, Philip Marlowe, by the way. Where's the raincoat, the fedora, the 45? Paul blinked. The 45 what? Mr. Porphyrogenitus narrowed his eyes. "Like that, is it? I understand. Of course, it's mostly just dehydration. That's what causes the headache and the sense of having been raised from the dead after 2 months in a lime pit. Next time, drink 3 glasses of water before you go to bed. You'll be amazed at what a difference it makes. So," he went on as Paul flopped into her chair, "how'd it go yesterday?" Yesterday? What the hell had happened yesterday? Excuse me? "The pictures with that long-legged bit from the typing pool. Get lucky?" Paul's eyes opened wide, but he lacked the necessary coherence to word a suitable protest. "No," he replied. "At least, we had a nice time and enjoyed the film, and then I went home." "You went home?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." Mr. Porphyrogenitus sighed and pressed the bridge of his nose between thumb and forefinger. "Right," he said. "And then you drank yourself into a stupor and went to bed." No," Paul said. Difficult to explain that he'd gone out drinking to celebrate his escape from having to go out for pizza with a friendly and attractive young woman. I stopped off on the way home and—" "Whatever. All right," the round man went on. "I'll just ask you to nip across to the cashier's room and fetch me the files marked 2004 reconciliations." He frowned, probably in reaction to the blank stare that Paul was sure he was wearing. "Think of the 101 Dalmatians. It'll help you remember. They should be right there on the desk." As Paul traipsed up and downstairs on the way to Benny Shumway's room, he was thinking, "I know that man. I've seen him somewhere just recently." But the librarian of his mental archive was obviously away for the day, and nothing came. Benny wasn't in when he knocked, but the files were there on the desk, just as the round-headed man had said they would be. Paul was just about to leave when something in the corner of the room caught his eye. Something about 3 feet long, wrapped in newspaper. It could have been a loaf of French bread, or an oversized clarinet, or an off-cut plastic water pipe, but somehow he did not think so. It was right next to the little door, the one with all the bolts and chains and job locks and yale locks on it that led to the land of the dead, the one that had slammed in his face the night of the christening party. Nothing to do with me, Paul told himself, but in his own mind he sounded like a child telling his mummy he's got a headache and shouldn't have to go to school on the day of the big maths test. Nothing to do with me, it's in someone else's room. I can't possibly just wander over there and take the wrappings off and look at it. What if Benny were to come back and catch me? But by then he'd already picked it up and peeled off the paper at the top, revealing the hilt of a sword. It was a small point of pride with Paul that he knew roughly as much about weapons as a shoebox knows about medieval Russian music. This sword hilt, however, he recognised it immediately. Last time he'd seen it, he'd used it to cut a cake and then decapitate a TV Yankerman. He'd worried a bit about the latter act from time to time since the event, but he was moderately certain in his mind that his victim hadn't been real, just a hallucinatory image planted in his brain by the goblins. further, or in the alternative even, if he had hacked a real head off real shoulders, killing a television presenter under any circumstances wasn't homicide so much as pesticide. But the fact remained that the blood left behind on the sword blade must have been real blood, because it had been good enough to get him, if not out of the land of the dead, at least as far as the doorway. With extreme caution, since he had reason to believe the edges were sharp, he slipped off the rest of the wrappings and studied the blade for a moment or so, just as he remembered it, the most striking feature being the whirling, looping fountains of silver patterning, not engraving or inlay, but deep in the grain of the metal, standing out clearly from the smooth, faintly glowing brown steel. It reminded him of something so strongly that he could almost see it. Something or someone. He heard noise and jumped away from the wall like a rubber ball bouncing. It was the sound of a key in a lock, which, in Benny's office, could only mean one thing. He swung around and stared at the connecting door, the one that led to death and the bank. The top bolt was slowly drawing back, grinding and graunching slightly against its retaining hoops, which wasn't good, because the bolt was on the inside.